Hi, Peter Charles here, Folk for Life Fly Fishing. And let's take a look at 10 tips for more effective streamer fishing. And this doesn't matter whether you're fishing for trout, smallmouth bass, largemouth, pike, it really doesn't matter. The basic concepts hold true for all species if we're fishing streamers for them. So let's get looking at the first one, which is all about lines. Okay, I use basically three kinds of lines for my streamer fishing, and the type of line I'm using really is dictated by the water conditions and the way I intend to present the fly and the fly that I'm using. There's a few things going into that mix. A lot of people will use a floater, and this is the Kelly Galoop streamer line from Airflo. And yeah, I use this, but I'm normally using this in relatively slow flows. And I'm also using it with a fly like my headstander fly, which will have a jigging motion when I strip it in on a floating line. So as I strip, the fly gets pulled to the surface, and then when I stop, the fly drops back down again. So if I want sort of that jigging motion, slow presentation, slow water, this is what I'm going to use. If I wanted my, streamer to be presented quickly and that far under the water, I'd use this too. You're not going to get a deep presentation out of a streamer if you use a floating line. And even if it's a weighted fly, it's not going to go very deep if you're stripping it fairly quickly in fast currents. So a line like this is either going to be a slow current line or a shallow presentation line. That's how we're going to be using floaters. Now, the line I most commonly use is an intermediate, and this is the Airflo Beach line. And I use an intermediate probably more than any other kind of line when I'm fishing streamers. And I have a video on fishing streamers on an intermediate. It's the most effective line you can use in a typical river situation where we get into moderately fast flows. You want to be able to get reasonable amount of depth. But the important thing about this type of line, and it's also true for full sinkers as well, that when you strip them back, they don't rise very much. In fact, they hardly rise at all. And because their angle that they present to the water is so shallow. And when you are stripping these lines back, your fly stays down. And this is the reason why I don't use sink tips to get a fly down when I'm stripping streamers, because when you strip a fly in current with the sink tip, the fly goes up. And it just will not stay down. You might get it down to begin with, but it won't stay there. If you want to keep the fly down, you're going to have to use something like this full intermediate. And the important thing about it is it has a floating running line. If you're going to use it in rivers, you need a floating running line, because when we strip that line in and it's going onto the water, we don't want it sinking. The other line I use is a full sinker, again with the floating running line. And this is more typically used in deeper, faster flows. I'll also use this for lake fishing as well. So it's not just a river-only scenario. And if I'm fishing in the shallows, I'll go back to the intermediate. I might even use the floater under certain circumstances in a lake. But typically in a lake, this is a line I'm using, and in a river in faster flows. So let's look at the next one. Now, this is probably going to be a tad controversial, but all I ever use for leaders is fluorocarbon. I never use mono for my leaders when I'm fishing streamers. And the reason for that is mono sinks a lot slower than fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon is denser, it drops more. So when you throw fluorocarbon in the water or mono in the water, in my tests, fluorocarbon seems to go down as much as 4 times faster than mono. So if you're fishing a relatively light fly, for example, and you're fishing it on this intermediate line, and you want a lot of action in that fly, if you used mono, the first part of that drift, the fly may actually hang up. The mono may keep it close to the surface. I've actually had this happen where my fly was down, the end of my fly line was down, but part of the leader was still stuck in the surface column, the mono leader. Fluorocarbon cuts through the surface film, so your fly gets down right away. So if you're using a light fly because you want a lot of action in it, and that's a perfectly good way to fish, then using fluorocarbon helps you to get that fly down, even though it may not be weighted. Now another one, this is even more controversial, use as long a leader as you can get away with. The longer the leader you can cast with that fly. The longer your leader, the more action your fly will have, the more separation you get between your fly line and the fish, which gets rather important when you're dealing with a full sinker. You don't want your fly line to be, swinging into the fish. And that long leader gives you that separation both vertically and horizontally if you've got a weighted fly or a fly that looks like my downforce flies that will get down on their own. If you've got flies like that, you get vertical and horizontal separation between your fly line and the fish. And that's a superior presentation. Plus that longer leader doesn't give the fish, the fly, that tethered look. It has room to move. And the other thing I do with them is I use a non-slip loop knot to give it even more motion. And the thing is, with a non-slip loop knot, the fly goes down like a rocket. So it's really a good way to fish a streamer is on a long leader. Don't get that, oh, all I need is 2 foot of mono. No, you'll catch way more fish on a longer leader. So let's get on to the next one. If you're going to fish streamers and you use a fly that doesn't sink well, a lot of people think, well, my sinking line or my sink tip or whatever is going to drag that fly down. I've got news for you. No, it won't. I mean, eventually towards the end of the swing, it might start getting down. But if that fly has some buoyancy in it, you'd be surprised what that fly can hold up in the way of a line. So you're not going to get any depth with your flies if your flies don't sink well. You test your flies, wet them first, then drop them in a bowl full of water and see how fast they go down. And if they tend to go down very, very slowly, I mean, that can present problems when you're trying to fish streamers, because for a good part of the swing, that fly is going to be out of position. So you want to make sure your flies sink well, and don't assume, test them. Drop them in water, make sure they work fine. Okay, hook types make a difference. And if you've seen classic streamers, let me pull one out here. Okay, there's a classic streamer with a down eye hook, very long shank, okay? Now, the problem with a fly like this is that it tends to ride sagging that gape because the center of gravity is so far back on that fly. Unless you're stripping fast and the current is strong, it will not want to ride even close to level. It'll want to sag. And what I've found is I go with hooks like this, shorter shank. This is a salmon hook. It has an up eye. And what I found is these flies tied on these kinds of hooks ride much closer to level, even in relatively slow currents. So they look more natural, all right? So, give your hook some thought when you're fishing it. If you are fishing one of these, long shanked streamer hooks, it's not going to ride that well in slow currents, and it's not going to ride that well when you're stripping it slowly. So you're limited to faster presentations if you want this thing to look good in the water. So give your hook choice some thought on how you present that fly for it to look good. And I know a lot of traditional streamers are tied on those long shank hooks, but you can see for yourself. Look in the water how that thing is hanging, and you'll see the back end of it's just hanging down. You'll get better results out of a shorter hook with an up eye because it will ride closer to level. See the next one. When we get out to a run, I mean, typically when we're casting streamers, we cast 45 degrees downstream at an angle, and then we swing it across or we strip it across, whatever. It catches fish, it works. But you have other choices. You can cast closer to 90 degrees. I've actually cast above that, gone upstream a little bit, and then stripped the fly to keep the speed up and let it come down and swing and then turn the corner. And as it swung around like that, I often got a lot of fish right on that swing of that corner. So don't be hung up on that down and across swing. There are plenty of ways to fish a streamer, and you don't have to be limited to just that 45-degree casting angle. I go anywhere from close to 60 degrees, 70 degrees when I'm looking for a specific seam that I'm trying to hit, all the way to above 90 degrees, like 100, 110 degrees upstream, and then strip that around and make it swing around. And I've caught a ton of fish doing that. Now, you've heard me use the word strip, you've heard me use the word swing. What I mean by swing is I just cast it out and keep a tight line and just let it come around in the current. Or I can cast it out and I can strip. Stripping line in, give it speed. Obviously, if you're in a slow current situation, you're going to have to give it some speed or your fly will just look dead, especially if you're in a lake. You have no choice but to strip. But when we're in current, we can swing, we can strip, or we can do both. One of the more interesting presentations, and this often will get fish, is you start it letting it swing in the faster currents, and as it gets to the slower currents, you start to strip it. Or if the current is more or less continuous all the way across, you could swing, strip, swing, strip, swing, strip, and you're getting this varying speeds. And when you start to strip, if a fish comes up behind that fly and is in that, do I want to take it? Do I not want to take it? Is that good to eat? And then you start stripping, bam, they'll grab it as soon as it starts to move away because it looks like it's fleeing. And it triggers that response to attack. So sometimes you want to swing if the currents are fast. Sometimes you want to strip when the currents are slow. And sometimes you want to combine them. And don't forget, if you're going from fast water to slow water, you might go from swing to a strip. So keep in mind that what we're doing with the stripping and the swinging is managing the speed of the presentation. And that goes back to what I was saying about the flies. So you've got to put these two together and say, what is that fly going to look like in that current flow, and how well will it appeal to the fish? So keep that in mind. You've got more than one way to do it. Now, this is something I don't see talked about very often. In fact, I don't see it talked about at all, is relate the speed of your presentation to the size of your streamer. If you're fishing a nice big streamer like that, that represents a large bait fish. Large bait fish swim well. They can move fast. They move in straight lines too. If you ever watched bait fish, large bait fish swim, they're going in straight lines and they're moving fairly quickly. So if you are presenting a large streamer, I would put long strips, keep it moving in a straight line. Now, if I'm going to fish a little streamer, if you look at little bait fish, they tend to dart and they don't go in fast straight lines and they don't move all that fast. So little short strips, dunk, 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 and erratic, and not the same speed all the time. So what we're doing is we're saying there's a little streamer imitating a little bait fish. Let's not strip it like mad, because that's not how little fish behave unless they're being chased. So when they're just swimming through the water and just doing their thing, picking up food, their movements are erratic and they move in short jerks and they don't move very fast. So present according to the size of your streamer. Keep that in mind. Now here's one that I also don't hear talked about very often, is that when you're swinging or stripping streamers, and if you get down to the level of the fish, which a lot of people want to do, what you're going to have, if that's the fish and this is your fly, if your fly is heading towards the fish will take off. A prey item does not charge a predator. So if a fish sees that fly coming right at it, it knows it's not natural, that's not real, and they don't have an ego. If they're not sure about something, they leave. They're not going to sit there going, that little thing won't bully me. That's a human emotion. Fish don't do that. It's like, they don't know what that is, it isn't natural, I'm out of here. They don't take chances. So what you want is a presentation that's above the fish or well in front of the fish. You don't want your fly heading straight at them. And this is where casting angle comes into play. If you're going to go deep, I would suggest you go on the shallow angle cast. If you're going to go shallow, then you can have a wider range of angles that you can cast at, because the fly is above the heads of the fish. But if you're going to go down low, I want that shallow angle cast so it presents butt end to the fish and it comes across and right in front, and if you get it making it look like it's a little weak in current, like it's having trouble holding its positioning current, the fish will go after it. But if you swing your fly at the fish, they're gone. Now this last item is very important, and I often see people screw this up. When you're stripping or swinging flies, streamers for fish, don't set the hook. The fish will set the hook for themselves. They'll hook themselves. If you're stripping and you big heave when you feel the fish, you'll just yank the fly right away from them. You have to give them time to grab hold of it. And they grab hold of it, and they often will turn, and grabbing and turning, and that's when they hook themselves. And you really don't have to do very much. The other thing when you put in a big hook set is that you're yanking the fly away from them and probably spooking them too. If you strip and they just hit it and they don't set the hook, you don't hook, just let everything go. If you're in a river, just let your line go and the fly will begin to tumble, then strip. And they'll be on it. They'll come back for round two, because what they've done is they've hit the fly in order to stun it so they can come around and eat it head first. And so you let the fly tumble, and then you start to strip, and the fish thinks it's getting away, it's recovered, and bam, they grab it. Works like a charm. If you've yanked, you don't have a chance to do that, because a lot of the times, especially with brown trout, you're getting stun strikes, where they come up, they whack it, and then they'll turn and eat it. And if you've done a big hook set, well, you've taken the fly out of their range and they give up and go away. So let the fish hook themselves. So there's the 10 tips for effective streamer fishing. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been living by this as a Bible, and I have caught tons and tons and tons of fish on streamers. In fact, I've caught my biggest fish on streamers doing exactly what I just talked about. So give these tips a try when you're out. And as I say, don't just get into this habit of just casting at 45 degrees and stripping and not thinking about your size of the fly, the type of line you're using, your leaders or anything. You know, the more thought you put into the streamer presentation, the more fish you'll catch. Cheers.